Guten Tag, welcome to the RB Sides, a music review channel dedicated to reviewing remix albums and EPs. In this review we're looking at the recent collection of reworks of Musik Von Harmonia, the iconic 1974 album from the ephemeral krautrock band Harmonia. You might not have heard of them, even though if you've been in a record shop at any point you might have caught sight of this bottle of detergent in passing. Outside of that though, they're not a hard band to miss. I did a YouTube search for Harmonia and it wasn't long before it dissolved into results for videos of Bone Thugs-n-Harmony. Nonetheless, Harmonia's legacy in experimental music is pretty legendary. Brian Eno called them the world's most important rock band, and David Bowie gave the band a shout out on German television in the 90s, largely to a wave of confusion. When it comes to the German avant-garde of the 1970s, there are undoubtedly bands who put the rock into krautrock more than Harmonia did. The three pillars of Can, Neu and Faust are normally who you'll hear about first in these discussions. And then at the more electronic end of the spectrum, you had Kraftwerk, who made pretending to be a robot into a pop music phenomenon long before Daft Punk ever got the idea. Arguably though, Harmonia did more than any of them to bridge the gap between rock and electronica, and on Record Store Day last month their cleaning product LP got a full double vinyl re-release, with one LP including a brand new set of remixes from a variety of artists in the world of electronic, ambient and post-rock. This isn't the first krautrock classic to get a full overhaul in recent years, but I'm covering this one first because 1. The original album deserves more attention, and 2. This remix album was released a few weeks ago, and I really need to start reviewing some 2024 stuff to be down with the kids. So let's take a look at what made the bloke from Roxy Music think this band was so damned important, and just how Musik Von Harmonia translates into the modern day. In music journalism, Harmonia are often referred to as a krautrock supergroup. You've got Dieter Mobius and Hans Joachim Rodelius of the electronic group Cluster. Here they are in action. I mean, they still move more than Kraftwerk. The other member of Harmonia is Michael Roffer, the multi-instrumentalist from the band Neu. Apparently the three of them weren't actually intending to start a band at all. What happened was that Roffer approached the Cluster dudes to ask if they wanted to perform live with Neu, given that the band had auditioned numerous other musicians for the task, and most of them sucked. Cluster didn't really want to work with Neu for reasons that never really been clearly disclosed as far as I can see, but they were interested in collaborating with Roffer nonetheless. So they did some jamming together, and the result was 1974's Musik Von Harmonia. I've known about this album for years, but prior to researching this review there's only one track I'd actually heard from it, and that's the lead song Watussi. I remember checking it out whilst at uni and enjoying it, and I've no idea why I didn't bother trying to actually buy the full album. Although I do remember having to dial down my eBay buying at one point, as I almost ended up spending $100 on a Sparkle Horse album. Or it might just be that I had no idea what to do with the track, given that it was so unique. I mean, you've got that driving bass, which is recognisably a krautrock device, but the synths over the top were pretty distinctive. They make it so that the entire hook of the track sounds like a cartoon mouse laughing. It's a distinctly 70s synth sound, and yet somehow that sound has managed to be enduring in a way that other synth sounds, particularly from the 80s, have ended up sounding dated. There's just a strange warmth to it that experimental electronica artists seem to have picked up on. Boards of Canada used it a lot on their debut album, Music Has the Right to Children. DJ and producer James Holden picked up on it, to the point where he even ended up using Watussi in a mix album he did in 2006. He's chucking this track in here in between two bits of contemporary electronica, and it fits supremely well. Another striking aspect of Watussi is the beat, which, if we go purely by the snare pattern, comes in at 71 BPM. That's pretty slow considering this is pretty much a prototype techno track. It doesn't feel slow because of the other rhythmic qualities here, but purely in terms of drum composition, this track beats dubstep to the half-step thing by almost 30 years. The track doesn't have any major shifts over its 6 minutes, but there's constantly new stuff happening in it. Soaring synths, bass growls, the squeak of someone drying a hefty bit of crockery. And then just as it faded in at the beginning, it also fades out at the end. All of the tracks here do that. They were all composed via improvisation and jamming, so there's a feeling that they started long before you got there and you just happened to walk in on the best bits. In terms of tempo, the album's kind of split half and half. You've got other up-tempo tracks such as Dino, which is probably the most stereotypically krautrock sounding track on the album. It's still got that distinctive Harmonia feel though, with the interplay between the guitar and the synth, constantly switching between each other to the point where you lose track of what's doing what. Then there's Veterano, in which the keyboard feels like it's being banged out by a clockwork toy. What I like about the keyboard stylings on this album is how different they are to krautrock's main competitor at the time, prog rock. Most of the keyboard work in 70s prog rock was about virtuosity, just cramming as many goddamn notes as you can into one solo. With Harmonia, the focus is much more on atmosphere rather than demonstrating performance chops. The three of them clearly have musical ability, but they're using it in service of the mood of the music rather than just to show off their dexterous fingers. And the percussion is often quite light and metronomic to assist the mood, with the drums on Veterano just sounding like footsteps of someone walking along a particularly pebble-stricken beach. Strangest of all the up-tempo tracks is probably Sonnenschein, which is German for close the curtains. This track has a similar synth style to Watussi, but it has a beat that sounds like it's being brought to you via a Hare Krishna street festival. The rest of the album is made up of more ambient experiments, mostly beatless. Probably the most striking track here is Ohrwurm, easily the darkest sounding track on the album. I was going for German on that pronunciation, I ended up with Wurzels, what can I do? Apparently this track was created from a 2-hour concert that Harmonia inflicted upon their friends, in which they tried to improvise some musical inspiration and almost came up empty. Apart from this, the title is German for earworm, which is ironic considering that there's very little in the way of melody here. It's built around a drone that sounds like a motorcycle speeding about, and this 2-chord sequence that sounds like 13-year-old me's idea of horror music, but much better. It's pretty bleak and unnerving, and actually sounds like a precursor to early industrial music, particularly that of Throbbing Gristle. And on the atmospheric flip side, you've got Ahoy, which is a much more dawn-struck kind of jam. It's this gentle blend of guitar, synth, and what sounds like piano that just has this peaceful, isolated quality to it. Feels like it'd be good music for an abandoned petrol station in the desert. It drifts along at this low level right until the last minute and a half, where they bang out this gorgeous uplifting loop from nowhere. It feels like it'd be good music for when you realise you've actually got spare petrol for your car, so you didn't need that station after all. And then there's the closing track, House Music, which starts out with a bit of a Tubular Bells style pattern to the synths. A big whooshing drone then underpins the track until it eventually fades away and you get what sounds like washed out incidental music from Postman Pat. really like the evocativeness of these ambient pieces. The only one that doesn't really do it for me is the album's 11-minute sophomore track, SQÜRL. It's a patchwork of various hums, synthesized strings, helicopters and light bird shrieks. It's decent enough, but it just doesn't really give me as much of an immediate fix as many of the other tracks on this album do. Overall though, I enjoyed this LP quite a bit, and it's not difficult to see why Eno was such a fan, to the point where after Harmonia had disbanded in 1976, he actively got the whole band back together again, so that he could record some work with them, which would eventually be released under the title Tracks and Traces. All of this was while David Bowie was waiting for Eno to come and join him in Switzerland to produce Low and Heroes, so, you know, he blew off the Thin White Duke for this band. And yet, even though sometimes influential albums don't stand the test of time due to the artists who copied them actually improving upon their sound, in this case I would say the album still holds up really well. I've heard quite a bit of krautrock and ambient stuff over the years, and much of this album still has a magic touch that separates it from the rest. With all that in mind though, what can musicians in 2024 bring to Harmonia's sound? At the time of recording, it's been 2.5 weeks since the remix album's release and no one's reviewed it yet. Seriously, I've looked in all the usual places. Pitchfork, The Quietus, Stereogum. None of them have touched this, even though most of them have covered Harmonia at some point in the past. Even Wire magazine, usually the last bastion of all things 70s experimental music, haven't said anything about this remix album for the last 4 issues. R.I.P. Steve Albini, by the way. All this means that as far as I can tell, this video that you're watching right now is the first full-length review of any kind of Musik Von Harmonia Reworks. You might think I'd be proud of my cutting-edge journalism. I'm actually furious. Means I've got no one else's opinions to steal for this review, so I'm going to have to come up with my own. I'm not entirely sure why this Reworks album has flown under the radar, although it does seem like the digital version's only been available in a few places like Spotify and Apple Music. When trying to find a download copy of this album, I checked my usual 4 Bs, Bandcamp, Beatport, Boomcat and Bleep. None of them had it. In the end, I had to crawl all the way back to the beginning of the alphabet and buy it off Amazon. You know, this is how you let Bezos win, right? Anyway, the Harmonia Reworks album contains 12 tracks, of which 9 of them are remixes of tracks from the original Musik Von Harmonia, and 3 of them are brand new collaborations by Harmonia themselves. Although I should point out that Dieter Mobius died in 2015, and Michael Roffer, based on the credits on this album, seems to be a little hands-off for all but one of the new tracks, so now it seems like Harmonia might just be Rodelius. I don't know when any of these tracks were made, and given that Rodelius has been constantly active in music over the last 50 years, it does seem likely that they could have been quite recent, especially given that the first 2 tracks, Harmonium and Idle Place, have some very contemporary sounding percussion. Other new aspects to Harmonia's sound include a slightly rockier guitar on Harmonium, which I believe is courtesy of David Pajo. While on the other 2 Harmonia originals, Idle Place and Wave by Wave, you actually have vocals. These are provided by Vittoria Maccabruni, who did a collaboration album with Michael Roffer a couple of years ago, and especially on Wave by Wave, I think her vocals work really well, giving the track a kind of Velvet Underground and Nico if they were an electronic act quality. Already from these 3 tracks we get a kind of blueprint of what Harmonia might sound like in 2024, so how do the remixers fare? First remix on this album is the Herbert full dub of Ahoy. Along with Watussi, it's one of 2 tracks on Musik Von Harmonia that the remixes here seem to have gravitated towards en masse. Other tracks on the album only get 1 remix each, or in the case of 3 of the tracks, SQÜRL, Sonnenschein and House Music, no remixes. which, given that Matthew Herbert is a house producer, seems like a missed trick there, but bleh. Matthew Herbert has plenty of his own gimmicks anyway, given that he spent the last 3 decades effectively being experimental music's answer to Heston Blumenthal. Most of his albums are built around music concrete elements, usually with a political underpinning to them. He's made records around household objects, body parts, capitalist tat. One album he made was entirely composed from a pig, covering its entire lifespan from, as Herbert put it, birth to plate.
Behold, he ate the pig.
And he's still up to his old tricks with his most recent studio album, The Horse, recorded with the London Contemporary Orchestra. An album which involved using an entire horse skeleton to make musical instruments out of.
So I just tried to find the biggest skeleton I could find, which on eBay at the time was a horse. And I bought it, and then it sat in the corner of my studio in boxes for a good 3 or 4 weeks whilst I panicked and thought, what on earth have I done?
Won't spend too much time reeling over it though, otherwise you won't have time to react to the horse semen shakers. Ignoring the elaborate way in which the album's been made though, it's actually a pretty decent album, if a little bit compartmentalised. A fair amount of the album just sounds like a film soundtrack without a film, sort of like Morricone versus This Heat. Although they did end up making a short film for YouTube in which I'm sorry, I can't concentrate with that. Guys, do you have to do that here? Serious? No, not now. Look, everyone's looking. Get a stable, you two. Halfway through the album though, it starts turning into more of a dumpy techno collection, and it is all the better for it. There's some fantastic tracks within this section. In his remix of Ahoy, Herbert effectively sticks close to the original Harmonia elements. So much in fact that it takes over 1.5 minutes for the beat to eventually come in, as he kind of nurses the synths and chords into a opening collage. Herbert used to have a manifesto called the PCCom, the Personal Contract for the Composition of Music, in which he stated that remixes should be completed using only the sounds provided by the original artist, including any packaging the media was provided in. And from the sounds of the beats on this remix, I can only assume that the parts were sent to him in a biscuit tin. Overall though, the elements from the original are very nicely spread out across this remix, and there's some cool new sounds at play here, including a stab that sounds like someone scraping a pen across a radiator. You also get lovely usage of the coda from Ahoy, which Herbert brings up out of the breakdown of the track as if he's charming it like a snake. It's a decent remix. I feel like it runs out of ideas after the breakdown and it just kind of chugs along until the end. There's no big hooks in it, more of a drift, but it would work well in a minimal house set, I reckon. Of the 3 remixes of Ahoy, I feel it's the Kaleema one that's the most interesting. Kaleema's own music is effectively Latin sophistipop with folktronica elements, which when you have to get that specific to describe it, you know you got something special on your hands. There's a lot of ethereal production here with reggaeton beats and Kaleema's own Spanish pop vocals that have something of a Kylie Minogue twang to them. She's also very partial to including played instruments such as flutes or violin, and you hear most of these elements in her remix of Ahoy. Starts off with the synth rhythms from the original that have been made to stutter like a stuck CD. Over the top of that, this ambient reggaeton techno beat comes in. With some great synth chirrups and what sounds like a piano trying to loosen itself up but failing. And when the violin comes in, it really steps up a notch. It's got a similar sun-bleached quality to that of the Avalanches on their Wildflower album. For the end of the track, she fades in the outro from the original and uses it in a very similar way, but it rounds the whole thing off perfectly. Energy-wise, the remix with the most in common with the original is the tape remix by Marta Salogni. Although not a household name, Salogni has had a frankly incredible underlying presence in experimental music over the last decade, with her website detailing the enviable list of artists that she's worked with, usually in the capacity of mixing or recording, but sometimes with some compositional input as well. In terms of her own music though, Salogni, very much as the name of this remix suggests, likes working with tapes. Her 2023 album, Music for Open Spaces, is a collaboration with the sadly deceased Tom Relline from Tamaga, and she uses tape machines throughout in order to manipulate sounds into this glacial, ominous, minimal patchwork. It's a solid album if you're into ambient stuff, but her sound does have quite a few similarities with that of Harmonia and Cluster, and as a result her remixes on this album feel very similar to the originals, to the point where I actually had to play these side by side directly in order to figure out what she'd done with them. She's basically changed the speed and key of the musical elements, added some reverb and removed the coda from the end, so the track just loops at the same level for its entirety. It gives the track more of a pulse and more of a sense of purgatory as a result. It reminds me quite a bit of some of the music that Laraji has done over the years, but I find the sense of stasis it creates a little too overwhelming compared to the original. Although it's nowhere near as static as her remix of Veterano, which is one of 4 tracks that only appears on the digital release of this album. Here she's remixing one of the uptempo tracks, and unfortunately her process is pretty much the same as it was for Ahoy, in that the main changes are that it's in a different key and it loops a lot more. I do like the way that the beats sound slightly stickier than they were in the original, but considering this is 6 minutes long, it ultimately ends up being way too minimal for my liking. In terms of the 3 remixes of the original album's opening track Watussi, I don't think you could have picked a more obvious fit for remixing this than James Holden. We've already discussed his use of the track earlier, but as an artist who started off in progressive trance in the early noughties, he then went on mid-decade to shift his sound into much more experimental territory. Taking in influences from Warp Records, jazz, and of course, krautrock. You can hear a lot of these elements fit together like a glove on his most recent album, Imagine This Is a High-Dimensional Space of All Possibilities. A blend of beautiful, inviting, and sometimes surprising electronica that is so powerful it can even turn a Teletubby's head into a bottle opener. On paper, he's a perfect artist to remix this track. In practice, however, I don't think this one really comes off. Like Herbert, he's effectively just transformed the original into a mid-tempo house context. Nothing wrong with that in concept, but in terms of execution, he has chosen to underpin this track with an absolutely heinous beat. It sounds like a horse galloping throughout, and occasionally there are these snare cracks that sound like a whip. It's almost as if someone told Holden that Matthew Herbert was on this album as well, and he was like, the horse guy, I can out-horse him any day of the week. Where's my horse?
Should a woman get on my horse?
And so you just have this really awkward, attention-seeking beat riding along for 6 of the track's allotted 7.5 minutes. The mouse-laughing synths, a lot of the harmonies there, and some of the squeals from the original are there as well. He's effectively replicating the feel of the original note for note, but in the context of this slowed down framework with that beat, it just sounds like he's time stretched it. There's no sense of progression here, it just gallops and then eventually the beat stops and it fades out. Yeah, I don't really know what he was going for with this one. It's the first Holden remix I ever recall hearing which I actually dislike, which is a shame given that it's the first one I'm actually ending up covering on this channel, but there you go. The other two remixes of Watussi are both by Scottish post-rock artists, starting with Ewan Mackenzie, aka Dextro. Based on his 2016 album In the Crossing, it seems like Mackenzie's approach to post-rock is kind of finding the point where it converges with indie dance. I like the first track, but a lot of the album seems kind of mild. And that's kind of the way I feel about his most recent album, An Hour is the Sea, in which he just does these two long suites. They're very much competent, but just don't really grab me. A lot of sun-drenched drones and complicated time signatures. What does grab me though is what he's done with Watussi here. I talked a little about how the original version flirts with downtempo as a result of the snare drum, but Dextro very much nails his colours to the mast on this one. He reshapes the synths into an 8-beat loop and he plays a trip-hop style drum beat over it. He then amps up the bass and starts playing around with the up and down energy of the track, just with subtle shifts in the composition. But what I really love about this remix are the 4 chords that he uses to basically lead up to the end of the track. They've got this soaring, almost choral quality to them, and yeah, they're kinda luscious. It's a really simple idea for rounding this track off, but my god does it work. The other Watussi remix is by Stuart Braithwaite from Mogwai, and he doesn't seem quite as confident in his approach to the track. Mogwai's original work can sometimes leave me cold, although I do enjoy a fair amount of their debut album Young Team. Listening to their most recent studio album As the Love Continues, a lot of it did feel like business as usual, although the rare vocal track Richie Sacramento sounded a fair bit like later period New Order to me. In terms of his Harmonia remix, it gets off to an absolutely cracking start. He fashions this kind of tragic choir loop out of what sounds like a kettle boiling. It's a really haunting bit of melody, and then he brings the elements from the original track in. But as soon as he's done that, he doesn't seem to know where to go with the rest of the track, and it just kind of rides out at that same level until the end, which is kind of disappointing. Feels like all tension and no release, and it's another remix where it just feels like they run out of ideas too quickly. Post-rock is also a descriptor you could apply to SQÜRL, the band who remixed the final track on this album, Dino. Although you could probably also add elements like psychedelic or stoner metal. SQÜRL are a band created by the film director Jim Jarmusch, originally as a kind of in-house band to soundtrack his films. Although last year, him and remaining band member Marta Salogni released their first ever studio LP, Silver Haze. I listened to it at the time. It's an album that struggles to really stake out any particularly fertile territory, as it spends so much time just doing these kind of noodly atmospheres that a lot of the time it forgets to add any flavour to the pot. And even vocal turns from Charlotte Gainsbourg and Jarmusch himself don't really seem to help that much. Although I will say, if you do check out one track from that album, I'd go with Garden of Glass Flowers, as that has a really pretty guitar line on it. Generally though, this lack of focus applies to their remix of Dino, as it feels like it's taking the vibe of the original but just smothering it with reverb. light bass line comes in eventually, and there are a couple of heavier synth chords over the top. But overall it has a lot of the same problems as SQÜRL's debut for me. It just has all this atmosphere without really knowing what to do with it. Strange that their film work seems to have had a lot more focus as far as hooks and grooves go. Maybe it's easier to make that kind of stuff when you know Tilda Swinton's got to be dancing to it. The final track I'm covering here is another one that didn't make it onto the LP, but quite frankly, of all the ones that didn't, this is the one that should have. It's a remix of Ohrwurm by Post Neo, who are an electro-pop duo from Germany. They only seem to have released a couple of EPs so far, but their sound has already got this very crisp quality to it with very precise beats and patient spoken word vocals.
Wieder.
And this Harmonia remix is really solid, kind of turning it into a moody down-tempo trip-hop track. Although by trip-hop I very much mean mezzanine rather than blue lines. They cut the elements from the original into this wonderful melodic cacophony that gives it this kind of modern horrorcore quality to it. They then add this light patting electro beat underneath. Moody, low-key, but it really coheres nicely, and above all else it's a beat that I would just love to hear a rapper over.
The beat is sicker than the blood in your stool. The way it repeats could trick you like a stuttering fool, uttering butter King Jules. His mother been cool, schooled her how to wash away the crud in the drool pool.
In fact, yeah, forget the electro-pop Post Neo, I think we found a new genre for you. So that was Musik Von Harmonia Reworks, an album which, despite its somewhat low-key release, is pretty solid. Although this is actually one of those remix albums where I find that respect towards the originals seems to hold some of the remixers back. And in particular, some of the bigger names that have been assembled here seem to be a little overawed by the originals, compared to perhaps some of the less well-known artists who seem to have a much clearer idea of what to do. As such, my favourite remixes from this are, there's about 3 that I could choose from. I would put in honourable mentions to Kaleema and Post Neo, who both take the source material in genuinely fresh, interesting new directions. Although in terms of the track that pulled it off the best for me, I'm gonna say Dextro's remix of Watussi is the one, as even though it seemed kind of simple in composition, it just had this very clear idea of what it was trying to do, and it pulled it off really well. Least favourite remix, sadly, was James Holden, as I feel he made one particularly questionable production choice that cost the whole track. But at the same time, I feel he's just a little too reverent of the original version, and even without that awful beat, I feel like this remix just doesn't really push the track in any particularly interesting directions. And are these remixes better than the original? Partly. As much as I'm a fan of the original Watussi, I absolutely love what Dextro did with the track, and I think the way that Post Neo used Ohrwurm as source material for a moody electro trip-hop track just gave it a breath of life that I really wasn't expecting. Also want to give a shout out to the Kaleema remix as well. It doesn't quite top the original for me, given that I think Ahoy is one of the best tracks on the album, but definitely a very strong attempt. And even if all of the remixes on this package don't hit home, gotta say the new Harmonia tracks on this are generally pretty damn good, so it's worth checking this out. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. Please do subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more reviews of this ilk. I like to cover a wide range of genres here, so even if krautrock and post-rock isn't your thing, then just stick around, we'll find some other stuff to bond over. And if you do know any remix albums or EPs I should cover on this channel, then do let me know your suggestions in the comments below the video. This review is over.